Why socialism is literally impossible. Uh-oh, here we go. This is to the Asmongold and to the streamers who want to be socialists. To the Hassans. So sorry.
Not good in theory, despite what you'll hear from people like Second Thought. But even opponents of socialism repeat this lie. So here's why it's impossible for socialism
all the
to
content
ever
creators who love the socialism.
Socialism is a society in which the means of production are held by all in common and subject to democratic decision-making.
Let's unpack that. First, the means of production, also called factors of production, are goods that are used to make consumers' goods. So a car can be considered a consumer's good because it's directly purchased and used by the consumer. And some factors of production for a car would be the metal used for the body, the rubber used for the tires, and so on. Also included as a factor of production would be the labor required to arrange these resources into the final state of a car. So we can define socialism in a more concise manner as the abolition of private property in the factors of production. The essential mark of socialism is that one will alone acts. It is immaterial whose will it is. The director might be an anointed king or dictator, ruling by virtue of his charisma. He may be a Führer or a board of Führers appointed by the vote of the people. The main thing is that the employment of all factors of production is directed by one agency only. One will alone chooses, decides, directs, acts, and gives orders. The distinctive mark of socialism is the oneness and indivisibility of the will directing all production activities within the whole social system.
Man, it kind of sounds like
Asmongold is that without private property in the factors of production,
where they want to just direct
cannot
people
know their
to
most
do
value
their bidding.
productive arrangement. Allow me to explain. Without private property, there is no trading of the factors, and therefore there is no prices for those factors, and therefore you cannot conduct profit-loss calculations. Consider a man in a socialist society who wants to build a railroad from city A to city B, but there's a mountain in the way. Going through the mountain would require more engineering because you have to design the tunnel, and going around it would require more steel because it's a longer route. Which should he choose for the good of the nation?
It seems he's left with an entirely arbitrary choice, not one based upon the relative scarcities of steel as opposed to engineering.
On the other hand, a greedy capitalist who wants to build from city C to city D is easily able to find the most value-productive route. He simply compares the prices of the two routes and picks the cheaper one. Not only does this benefit him in minimizing his costs, but in minimizing his costs he actually frees up the rarer bundle of resources for other people to use. This is because on the market, prices are not arbitrarily slapped on there by the owner. Rather, they represent how much people want that item. Consider a car chassis. Should you construct it out of steel or titanium or carbon fiber composites or something else entirely?
Well, I would
just
say
say that the carbon fiber.
I would say the exception to this one would be software, because it seems like in the software industry, some of that shit is kind of just slapped on price tags, or they don't tell you. Right, they don't tell you the breakdown of how they got to that price point, right? For tech stuff, or well, at least for like downloadable software and shit like that you buy over the internet or something like that, right?
Is the best choice because it's strong and lightweight. What he isn't considering is that
I guess you could
required for certain other
you could say that they tell you all of that stuff if you read
on the market, those people whose
what's exactly in the software. They tell you what
fancy
exactly you're
will
buying.
Bid up the price, such that
all the
budget
features
manufacturers aren't willing to pay for it anymore, so they go for cheaper materials like aluminium.
You would have to be a tech person to understand
this shows
all
that
that
others
stuff.
understand how to make a better use of the goods in question. The socialist central planner cannot conduct these profit-loss calculations, called economic calculation, because he does not have access to prices for the factors of production. In the words of Mises, he is groping in the dark. So here we arrive at the impossibility thesis, summarized as follows. 1. Without private property in the factors of production, they cannot be traded. 2. If the factors cannot be traded, there can be no factor prices. 3. If there are no factor prices, economic calculation is impossible. In other words, a socialist economy is strictly an impossibility. The central planner cannot compare the efficiencies of different lines of production in order to pick the best one. When a capitalist entrepreneur makes a mistake by building his cars,
some of these people don't know what efficiency is, or how to move things at a smooth pace so that nothing gets fucking clogged in the pipeline, right?
There's titanium instead of steel.
Too many of these people are too lazy, right? Sometimes. Fucking procrastinate at the wrong fucking time sometimes.
He knows he's doing something wrong because he's losing money, and he knows where he's losing money as well. Moreover, this provides us with a type of natural selection which pushes us towards better and better entrepreneurs. Those entrepreneurs who are better at finding the most efficient line of production will outlast those who are worse at it, so you should expect the market to tend towards the most efficient line of production for any given product. Of note here is that the impossibility thesis is not of the form, boy howdy, it sure would be difficult for a central planner to get all the information he needs to plan effectively. Rather, it's of the form, it's literally impossible for the central planner to even begin to get the first bit of information to plan effectively. The former is a different problem, called the knowledge problem, essentially saying that the knowledge people use to plan their own lives is initially distributed, and it can't be effectively collected up by a central planner. The knowledge problem isn't per se unsolvable, you might overcome it with enough computation or sci-fi tech, but the impossibility thesis, called the economic calculation problem, cannot be solved no matter how much tech or computation you throw at it. Consider the analogy of finding the average weight of an adult unicorn. Unicorns don't exist, so we don't know what properties they would have. So therefore you can't begin the calculation to find the
how do you
average weight of one.
calculate
This
something
problem could
that's
not be resolved by purchasing a better calculator. The issue isn't that the computation is super difficult to do, it's that you can't begin the computation because you have no data to compute with. Figuring out what people want is the knowledge problem. Figuring out how to produce what people want is the economic calculation problem. The first is fantastically difficult. The second is impossible.
There it is. He said it.
Proposed solutions to this problem have been
I didn't pre-watch
socialists,
this, by the way.
The first of which is gross
Jesus.
output planning, practiced by the Soviet Union.
Each ministry that oversaw an industry was given a certain target, a certain amount of nails to produce, a certain amount of chandeliers to produce, a certain amount of tractors to produce.
Well, when you're at a construction site, you're given a certain amount of wood, nails, hammers, right?
Factory managers,
Bodies.
They were given targets.
This gross output planning was not sufficient to solve the problem, however.
There were a lot of structures in the Soviet Union, a lot of industrial buildings and homes that were completely finished and ready for people to move in, except they didn't have any roofs on them, okay? Why didn't they have any roofs? They didn't have any roofs on them because the nail industry only produced very big nails. Very heavy, big nails. They didn't produce the smaller roofing nails.
Oh, because they didn't have the...
Why did they do that?
They didn't have the machinery.
Because the target was given in terms of tons. So the bigger the nails you produced, okay?
They just didn't want to change production.
It was easier to do to fulfill your target of certain tons of nails. Women continuously complained that there was no clothing that fit them, petite women in the Soviet Union. The reason? Because the apparel industry they were given a target in terms of yards of cloth, so everybody made huge dresses, okay? And it was very difficult to get children's clothing for that reason.
So basically,
in
checklists to do
economy,
certain
of course, you
objectives
have prices.
in the job
If there's
market.
few children's clothing or not enough clothing for petite women, not enough dresses and so on, the price of those things shoot up, right? It's high profits to be made and resources are shifted.
In the end, the only way the USSR was able to stay afloat for even such a short period of time was by copying prices found elsewhere in the world where socialism
so
had
they just
completely
made
enthralled
fucking
industry.
prices
Of
up,
course, these
basically.
external prices were not accurate representations of scarcities within the Soviet Union, and this still leaves us with no solution should the central planners be so successful that they manage to attain world socialism. The post-Keynesian economist Joan Robinson proposed a steady state economy as a solution to the ECP, essentially keeping all lines of production static, just the way they were on the final day of capitalism. The problem here is that this is no solution at all.
Prices,
you still rely on the capitalist
rates.
economy to demonstrate those lines to be efficient in the first place. And should any changes occur over the time that you run your socialist experiment, society will be incapable of detecting and reacting to these changes. In that sense, you still do not have a socialist economy. Rather, you plug your ears and pretend that society is in perpetual stasis. Meanwhile, real-world conditions
like
steadily
what
creep
Biden
away
was
from your initial
trying to
conditions,
do.
leaving your lines of production with ever-weakening efficiency. Phillips and Rosworski argue in The People's
he
Republic
did
of
weaken
Walmart that
efficiency,
big companies
that's
such
for
as
sure.
Amazon and Walmart already operate internal, centrally planned economies, which are
just
bigger than
look
the
at how
Soviet
many
Union,
businesses
thus proving that the
fucking fell.
ECP is surmountable.
The whole
But both
COVID.
Walmart and Amazon do have factor prices. They don't get everything for free. They have to pay for it. There is, however, a kernel of truth to this argument. As a company grows in size and swallows up more and more factors of production, there is this ever-growing internal socialism. That is, they do not have internal factor prices. And as this company keeps growing, it will be ever less efficient at allocating means. which implies that a natural
Like
monopoly
the,
is strictly impossible.
like the
A
video
large
games
gigafirm which
industry,
controls all of
like
the
all the
widget
AAA
production would
companies.
struggle to allocate means in the
Oh,
exact
man.
same way that the Soviet Union did. This implies that it could not maintain any sort of dominant position for very long at all.
They're all those
as any
prices are all
smaller
fucked
competition
up
would be
because
far
now
more
they
apt
want
to
to
find the most
they want to
value-productive
jack up the
uses
prices
different
for people to
factors.
pay for like
Moreover, this
$80
internal
games.
socialism is still just that.
When we're not even
In
paying
turn,
for like
should any
physical
firm come to
discs
own all
anymore
of the
and shit.
factors of
It's like,
production, there would be no
man.
external prices to
And
use.
it's
So
been
a
going like
pure
that for a
socialist
decade
economy
now.
remains impossible. The only way out of this pit is for the socialist to grit his teeth, admit that his society could not
So they're
advance
trying to
beyond a
offload the
hunter-gatherer
price
level,
onto us now
and say
somehow.
that it's still better because of equality or whatever. But there remains a defeat even to the knowledgeable socialist who accepts the calculational chaos that would ensue, because the socialist ethic cannot make for a human ethic. Let's consider what the claim that factors should be commonly owned by all would entail. First, we note that the owner of a thing is he who has complete and final say over how that thing is to be used. Consider the example of Crusoe and Friday on an island. Crusoe owns a stick and he wishes to use it for spearfishing, but Friday wants to use that same stick to stoke his fire. These actions cannot take place simultaneously, so if one action goes forth, it
Yeah, they have
necessarily
to be
excludes
independent
the other.
from each
Therefore,
other,
only
yeah.
one person is able to win the conflict over its use. The
Yeah.
owner of the stick, Crusoe in this case, is said to be the one who should win any conflict over its use. So here, Crusoe should be allowed to use it to spearfish, and Friday should not be allowed to use it to stoke his fire. How ownership comes into being is of prime importance here. Under true ethics, which are detailed in this video, ownership is granted to the initial possessor of a thing, until such a time that he decides to trade it or abandon it. This initial possession is called homesteading, and this prior-later distinction is presupposed by anyone who would have a conflict over anything. Imagine A is the initial possessor of Alpha and B initiates a conflict over its use. B is presupposing that he should own it instead of A, but implied in B owning Alpha is that other people shouldn't have the right to take Alpha for themselves. So B is presupposing that should control of Alpha be wrestled away from him by C, he would still own it. C would not own it. That is to say, B presupposes that
basically
ownership
if-
and possession
essentially,
are
if you're
distinct,
trying to
but what
steal
is implied
something
in
from
the idea
someone,
that
it
the
would
right to
still be
possess,
yours,
ownership,
correct?
that is distinct from mere possession. It means that if there is any ownership at all, and those who quarrel over things are all asserting different ownership claims and thus presupposing ownership and its distinction from possession,
yeah, and
then
then
it does
property.
not accrue merely to those
Yeah,
who take things
so-
from others. That is, if B
Is
takes
this
a
your
thing by force
property?
from
Yes,
A,
no.
this
Are
cannot,
they-
in
and
and of
then they're
itself,
trying to
make B
steal
the
your
owner.
property?
Why? Because
Yes.
if it did,
Well,
it
you
means
should
that
probably
C could take
slug
from B
them.
and thereby become the owner. This just means that there is no such thing as ownership. There is only possession. Might makes right, so to speak. But this contradicts the presumption that ownership and possession are different. From this very simple idea, we can see that the entire Lockean idea of first use, first own follows. Why? Because if taking some good by force from its previous possessor is not sufficient to ground an ownership claim, then by Misesian-style regression it becomes obvious that only the first possessor/user can have an ownership claim. Every other person takes it from a previous possessor and is thus a mere possessor.
Basically
not an
the
owner. The
telephone.
first possessor, the person who plucks the resource from its unowned
Game of
state out of the
telephone.
commons, is the
In
only
terms of who
possessor does not
possesses
take it
the
from someone
item
else.
at the
This is why
beginning.
first possession imbues the homesteader with the
And then you
unique
start,
status
right,
of ownership. i.e.
borrow-
the first user
say
or possessor
someone
of a good is
starts
either its
borrowing
owner or
it,
he's
right.
not. If he's not, then who is? The person
then
who
they
takes it from
forget
him
to
by
give it
force?
back. That-
If
they are not
forcefully
the
taking
still-
possession
they are
from
not
a
the
prior
owner, right?
entitles the new
Yeah.
possessor to the thing, then there is
They-
no
they
such
essentially
thing as
stole it
ownership,
from you.
but only mere possession. But such a rule, that a later user may acquire something by taking it from the previous owner, does not avoid conflicts, it rather authorizes them. In other words, we can see not only that Lockean homesteading is inextricably bound up with a prior-later distinction and opposed to the latecomer ethic, but that the very idea of ownership implies that only libertarian-style ownership is justifiable. The socialist ethic fails on the further grounds that it implies group ownership, but group ownership itself implies a contradiction. Suppose that a set of people,
Correct.
A through Z, commonly
Yeah, so it basically, if you were to own this house, well, it's not your house anymore. It's the group's house.
own a stick. What is to be done about a dispute over the stick between
Or,
members
well, it's
in
the
this
government's
set?
house.
Say that A wants to use the stick to
That
spearfish,
then
but B does not
divvies
want
it
the
up
stick used in
against
this
it,
way,
right, for
under
the
the
peop-
assumption
right,
that they
for
both
the
own
people.
it. They should both justly win the dispute. So the spearfishing is simultaneously just and unjust, a contradiction. Some advocates of group ownership attempt to sidestep this by having a group decision-making process. Say that all the members take a vote and the majority decide that it should be used
Oh
to
no,
spearfish. This
democracy.
would imply that anyone who
Oh
lost the vote
no.
did not own the stick, as they were determined to be the just losers in the dispute. But to say that they do not own the stick
Oh, no,
contradicts the assumption that
democracy.
every
What?
member of the set owns the stick. There exists no way out of this. Group ownership simply cannot solve for conflicts
It's an
between
oligarchy.
members. Furthermore, we turn to Second Thought's laughable claim
Oligarchy.
that
The central
Yes?
idea that unites all socialists
Wait,
is
we should get
freedom.
his
good
claim
old
is that
Bernie
under
to say
capitalism, the boss
oligarchy.
has all the power,
The
leaving his
greatest
workers helpless
socialist
but to
on,
obey his
on the
every
fucking
whim,
world,
citing one's wage as an arbitrarily chosen sum.
Your
So,
paycheck isn't
yeah, I'm so
determined by
sorry.
the job you do, but by what your boss decides it to be.
This argument is quite hilarious in that a wage is only truly arbitrary if you do not have private property and factors. Recall above that labour was one of the factors of production, so it's only under socialism that the price attached to labour, i.e. the wage, is arbitrarily chosen by the will that plans. Moreover, a capitalist entrepreneur who hires labourers cannot get away with paying whatever wage he pleases. If that was the case, why would he pay any money at all? For as much as socialists like to paint entrepreneurs as having insatiable greed, it's odd that they would ever temper this hunger to give anyone anything in exchange, ever. Far from an arbitrary decision by the capitalist, one's wage is determined the same way the price for anything is determined on the market. Through a bidding mechanism. Just as I cannot sell a coffee mug for $1 trillion ounces of gold, I can't sell my labour for that much. It's simply not what it's worth. The flip side is that I also cannot purchase a coffee mug for a single penny, or get one for free. And the same goes for labour. If I want someone to work a till for me, I have to bid for their labour against all of my competitors. I might want to pay them only 50 cents an hour, but then my competition raises the bid to $1. I respond by raising it to $2, and so on. This bidding process is limited by the productivity of that person in that particular line of work. If I expect that them working the till will net me an extra $7 per hour, I'm not going to be willing to pay them any more than that. Therefore, we should expect this person's wage to tend towards $7 an hour for till working. This is why minimum wage policies create involuntary unemployment. If the minimum wage is set at $10 an hour, this till worker is going to be hard pressed to find anyone who's willing to hire them for that price. Furthermore, both the worker and the capitalist perceive this relationship to be beneficial, else the loser would not accept the trade. To elaborate, consider the differing time preferences between the worker and the capitalist. A time preference is how much one values a present good over a future good. So a person with a relatively high time preference might eat a potato right now, whereas a person with a lower time preference would plant that potato, wait 6 months, and he'll have 10 potatoes. The low time preference man values the 10 potatoes 6 months from now higher than the 1 potato now, and vice versa for the high time preference man. This is one reason why capitalists are able to hire workers. For instance, I might expect that I can sell my 1 ton of lumber for 100 ounces of gold upstream, but I first have to transport it upstream. I expect that the task would take 3 workers 10 hours to complete, and that I'd need to wait a further 50 hours in order to find a buyer. I find 3 such workers who are willing to do the job at 20 ounces of gold each, and they receive payment immediately upon delivery to my warehouse. A further 50 hours pass, and I do indeed find a buyer who pays me the 100 ounces. So I have netted 40 ounces of gold, and each worker only 20. So why on earth do the workers agree to this arrangement? For a start, I will have had to expend capital in getting the 1 ton of lumber cut and processed in the first place, which comes out of my cut. Second, I only get my 40 ounces after waiting 50 hours after the workers have already been paid. This requires a relatively low time preference. Third, the capitalist takes on all of the risk. Each of the workers know that they'll definitely be getting their 20 ounces, whether a buyer can be found or not. For instance, it might not take 50 hours, but instead 300 hours to find a buyer.
Already getting
and
a
perhaps
fixed
by that
salary
point, a massive surge in the supply of lumber means that I can only get 60 ounces of gold for it. In this case, I have made no money whatsoever, whilst each of the workers walk away with their 20 ounces apiece. Furthermore, Second Thought claims that another problem with capitalism is that it's anti-democratic. He's correct that it's anti-democratic, but this isn't the problem. A democratic outcome does not imply an ethical one. To demonstrate, consider the following. 10 people are on an island, and 9 of those people want to gang rape the remaining person. Putting this to a vote would yield that the rape should indeed go forth. So we found an instance of just rape under the democratic ethic. In fact, any mob-based crime is determined to be just by democracy, by the nature of democracy as mob rule. Throughout Second Thought's video, you notice a pattern of find a problem, blame capitalism, and claim socialism would solve that problem.
I mean, democracy is a little bit
for instance,
like that,
claiming that the housing crisis is caused by capitalism, when in fact we know it's the fault of fiduciary media introduced by aggressive state legislation. This cycle of blaming capitalism for...
Yeah, I mean, once you go public for a company, yeah, you're beholden to your fucking shareholders, right? You have a fiduciary, right, need to do something for them, right?
Every woe in the world
they paid
is
you to
nothing
do
more than
that
a
thing
dishonest
for
grift.
them.
And to understand why, you have to watch this video by Mentis Wave.
There you have it. Who else is a socialism? Who wants to get stabbed? I'm just kidding. But there you have it. You just pissed off several 14-year-olds? No, you pissed off a lot of people who just want to be neats in their house and want to, right, bum off people. I'm so sorry. Alright, there you have it. Liquid Zulu. Why socialism is literally impossible.